So this is Tim Beckley speaking, and he's going to start off and kind of begin with the introduction, and then I will introduce the speakers and talk for a minute about BrandQ, and we'll get started. So Tim?
Yeah, well, thank you first for everybody for joining the webinar today. We have a really wonderful attendance from around the world, and everyone will receive a copy of this. Today's topic is reality check, brands, color tolerances, and machine capability. These are things that we talk about and work on every single day within the supply chain, which are really very disparate across the world. And when you combine this between ISO standards and color specifications and brands' expectations and certain tolerances that exist, especially as they tie into machine capability, they become extremely important. And one of the main reasons we created BrandQ was to create a common language across the supply chain and bring this education and standardization to one place to really tighten up the global supply chain for everyone to participate in, which includes all the technology that goes into it, and from top to bottom, from creative all the way to production output. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to my friend Ron Ellis.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tim. My name is Ron Ellis. I'm your consultant based in the northeast of the U.S., and I work a lot with brands. So I spend a third of my time with brands, probably a third in printing plants, doing calibration and color matching and things like that. And a bunch of time training and doing stuff with Idealliance as well. I'm chair of the Print Properties Committee, which works on Idealliance's print standards and guides and information that can be used by end users, printers, and brands. And also, I'm a brand trainer for the brand program. We have other guests who are on with us today who are really great and have really good information. First one is Jack Frank, and he's the color process manager at MPS Multipack Solutions West Rock. And one interesting thing today that I found out, because I grabbed his picture from LinkedIn and I popped it in here, but he actually drew this picture. I assumed he had had a emoji made or some type of little thing generated, but he sketched it and drew this himself. Did you draw this online, or is this pencil?
It's a pen and ink sketch.
Cool. Yeah, it came out pretty neat. That's very impressive. So Jack's going to talk. He deals with brands all day. He deals with color all across the MPS and West Rock, in pretty much around all of North America, Canada, Mexico. He's dealing with the toughest customers and with making sure they have the same color all over the place. And he bumps into this topic probably every day, maybe more than once a day. Also, we have Jason Campbell. And Jason I've known for a long, long time. He was one of the original programmer for Spot On, and now he's developer and color services guy for X-Rite and works on ColorCert, but has a huge knowledge of color and touches a lot of the brands they work with and the needs that they have as well. So Jason is also going to today share what they run into, and I found some of what he's going to talk to us about to be pretty fascinating, because it's a different approach than a lot of people take with these standard metrics that we use.
And Jason drew this picture of himself as well.
Yeah, I was just about to say I did a very good job. I have to hold a candle to Jack's artistic capability.
Yeah, and the way that it goes is we're going to do about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes with each presenter, and then we have Q&A at the end. So we'll start off with Jack, and he's going to talk, or actually before we do that, I'm going to talk for 2 minutes really quick about BrandQ. BrandQ is Idealliance's program for brands and suppliers, and it's built around three things. How do we communicate? How do brands and suppliers communicate? How do we educate each other on what we need and the knowledge we need to be able to successfully print and assess and communicate what we're trying to do? And how do we validate actual printed results? This is educate. You can see this is one of our classes. There's a bunch of print buyers and designers here, and they're working and doing actual measurements and learning how to measure and work on color. Communicate, this is same thing in one of our classes, people looking at a difficult printed sample and talking about How do we measure it? How does the visual relate to the measurement? And how do we assess that? And then validate, we have a whole bunch of kits and things. And Idealliance also does some validation as well for some pretty large brands where they, much like the G7 Master Certification Program, they do have a lab that does qualification as well. But that's our program. If you're interested, it's online. And in addition, we have live classes that occur as well. So if you're interested, go to idealliance.com/brandq and you can get more information. So Jack, I'm going to have you start off and you can kind of share what you have, and when you need to, give me some type of warning when you need to pop to the next piece.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Appreciate it.
Yep.
So brands want print consistency. Our customers expect the colors for their packaging to be consistent and accurate, especially when it comes to their brand colors. And because color plays such an important role, it drives consumers' decisions when choosing between competing products. The color we print is a direct reflection of our customers, so it's extremely important that color management is dialed in. The challenge is consistent print across multiple suppliers with multiple printing methods on multiple substrates. And if you don't mind, Ron, just advance that to the next slide. The issue, I think, comes in when customer expectation doesn't equal process capability. So we have to make sure that print targets and tolerances and those expectations are capable of being achieved no matter how we're printing it, no matter what printing method is being used. Both print providers and brands really become frustrated if the printing process capability doesn't line up with the customer's expectation. Sometimes the print process can be improved. Sometimes customer expectation needs to change. And brands sometimes utilize a third party to monitor print quality. It's a print analysis intermediate. Can you advance those slides a little, Ron? So a print analysis intermediate, or a pane, as some printers may say. And I say that, in a kidding way, over the past several years, I've been the primary contact between the MPS facilities and third parties that provide these print quality programs for big brands. And without a doubt, these PQA programs have helped MPS attain, more easily attain the goal of one corporate standard. And I think we've become better printers for it. But sometimes the evaluations aren't always in line with the printing capabilities. Okay. So meeting expectations, of course, may require passing this type of third-party evaluation, and that evaluation has to be in line with the industry best practices. The last thing a manufacturer wants, a printer wants, is to introduce multiple standards into one printing environment. So print standardization is essential. We need standardized targets for CMYK and spot colors, and that's really what Idealliance is all about. Measuring print is essential to print standardization. You can't control something unless you measure something. So measuring CMYK, the red, green, blue overprints, dot gain, gray balance, the paper colors, spot colors, all of that's essential in order to control our print and make sure that it's complying with the standard that we're printing to. But those targets and what they consider to be an acceptable tolerance have to fit within the process capability. Sometimes the targets can be, unrealistic. For example, on the next slide, this slide here is CMYK and spot color targets. They have to be adjusted relative to the paper that it's printing on. And often the spot color targets were derived from, in the case of Pantone, they may have been derived on a stock that's very different from the stock that we're printing on, with pigments that were not fade resistant and not coatable, which means that even some of the spot color targets are not achievable when you're using fade resistant and coatable pigments. So those targets would need to be adjusted if the expectation is that they be fade resistant and coatable. In the case of extended gamut printing, it's important that our brand owners, our customers, understand that EG colors are not spot colors. Most of the extended gamut software that's out there predicts the best delta E possible to the spot color target. That delta E is only accurate if the press was run exactly the same as the profile run, which realistically is impossible. All manufacturing processes have some variation. So let's use this example. For offset printing, let's factor in 1.5 delta E for normal press variation, and then on top of that, add another, let's say, 0.5 delta E for instrument variation between the spectra being used at the shop and the spectra that's being used by the brand or the third party that's monitoring print quality. That said, if we're factoring 1.5 for press variation and 0.5 for instrument agreement, that means that we would have, and the brand is expecting the EG color to be under 2.5, that would mean all predicted delta E for all spot color simulations would need to be under 0.5 delta E. And for most print process capability, this would be impossible. So if the brand wants to print extended gamut and enjoy the cost breaks that are associated with that, either the tolerance or the target should change. And lastly, it's really all about communication. The brands and the printers, we want the same thing. We want to provide the brands with the best product possible. So all parties have to work together to set realistic expectations, agree on appropriate targets and tolerances, and standardize tighter manufacturing capabilities.
Great. Thank you, Jack. Yeah, and then we'll have, if you have questions, text those in so you can do the chat, and that will send it, and we'll collect all the questions there too. And then I'm going to talk for a couple minutes, and I'll show a couple examples. And Jack and Jason, if you can jump in if I'm hitting a topic that you have an opinion on. But anyway, I'll talk a little bit about brands. I'm going to talk about tolerances, and I'm going to talk about machine capability. And what I'll talk about is what are the tolerances that brands use? How do we tell machine capability, and what happens when the tolerance a brand requires is tighter than we can actually do? So if we look at tolerancing, there's a few places that a brand can go to get tolerances. The first one is, as Jack mentioned, is industry standards. So if we start with the industry standard, something like Grackle or something like that, or even just the G7 pass-fail requirements, then we've got something that most printers are already used to. So their inks may be aimed at it, the tolerances in their systems are kind of centered around these standards. So it's a good spot to talk or start at, because that's where most of the industry is already aimed at. The other thing about tolerancing that I find that is really important for brands to do, and they don't always do it, is talk to the supplier. So you could see from the slides before that Jack knows realistically what most of their machines can do. And, you know, if you were to say, I need something to be, you know, a certain delta E in a certain process, he would be able to say, maybe that's a little too tight, or, you know, that shouldn't be an issue. So most suppliers, and not all of them, but suppliers who are really have their process nailed down, they'll know what those machines can do and what tolerances are realistic. So it's very important not just to throw a tolerance at a supplier, but to make sure that relates to what they can do. These are some brand tolerance numbers. So I'm going to throw these out, and on my laptop here, I have specs from different brands, and they all have these numbers on them. So for a spot color, a really common tolerance would be 3 delta E, 2000. That's quite common. That's a tolerance that a lot of people would hit. As we get into the higher end and more discriminating brands, we might start getting into the 2 delta E range, where the brand is saying we require that all the spot colors are 2 delta E. And we could get even to tighter ones, and I have a bunch of brands I work with who actually require 1.5 delta E. And if you think about what Jack said about, you know, between instruments, you've already got 0.5 delta E, and you know there's variation on the machine. So as you're getting down to this range, you're getting into the zone of, I won't say impossible, but much more expensive and much more difficult.
Very little wiggle room.
And that, very little wiggle room. There is no room for error, and realistically, to hold that through the entire run, you know, is really hard and almost impossible. Then you get down to some brands, and I actually have some specs on my hard drive where they're asking for 1 delta E. And this brand has 1 delta E for a process build, and that is even harder than a spot color. So you can begin to see as you get down into there that you know, what people begin to ask for, you know, they really, what do they want? 0 delta E. Well, that's not possible. So, you know, these tolerances, they get tighter and tighter, and the more expensive the brand product is and the more critical that their work is, they're going to start asking for this type of thing. But I have one customer who had 0.4 delta E as a spec, and we ended up having to take that off from litho and move it to inkjet, and even then we threw out 50% of the product. So, you know, the friendly, realistic ones are 2 and 3 delta E. The super tight ones get down around 1.5, and there's not much 1 delta E out there, though some people ask for it. And then in the process world, we have G7 specs, which are pretty well known by printers, and delta CH for gray, and then delta L for tonality. So these are other things that people would measure, and these are detailed in the G7 master pass-fail document. It gives you kind of good points in here to see where people would be, if everything's right on good paper running correctly, what it would be like, although maybe a little tighter than normal production. Now, how do we figure out what these numbers should be? If you look at the screen right there, you can see there's 2 different presses, both Heidelbergs in this case, but 2 different presses. And it should be fairly obvious to you guys that maybe the machine on the right, while it could produce good color, may not produce as precise or accurate color as the machine on the left. So when we look at machine capability, if I had to figure out what delta E's I would get and what my tolerances would be, if I was printing on the machine on the right, I would expect higher delta E's. I'd expect a lot more variation and different print quality. If I was printing on the machine on the left, which is a brand new 10-color XL106, then on that machine I would expect lower delta E's. It's a newer press, so I'd expect it to be even across the sheet, much better accuracy and consistency. This idea here is really, really important because I deal with brands who print all over the world, and especially, so if I think of my high-tech brands, they might be running on the thing on the left, or some of the higher-end food products and things, they'd be on the left. Cosmetics would be on the press on the left. But if I thought of textile, fabric, underwear, clothing, even with some higher-end brands, they might be running on that machine on the right because the packaging occurs nearby to where the manufacturing occurs. So there's a very, very different set of tolerances that I get. The machine on the right, the 1.5 delta E or 2 delta E, pretty good. And that machine coats in line, so I could have a final finished measurement. The machine on the right, I would expect much higher. 3 delta E doesn't coat on line, so I can't get a live measurement. So very, very different tolerances based on the capability. So you're going to find it to be quite different. And you have to keep that in mind. If you're in a region where you're manufacturing and packaging close to it, you have to live within the capability of the machine. They can't do the impossible. The way that we tell machine capability is we measure both the variability and we measure how that machine works. And then we basically compare that with our specification. The idea is we need to know what a machine can do. And in a lot of the industry, we know generally what machines can do, but you really, really need to be able to tell, can they achieve what you want? And a lot of that may be, are they a good printer, good plant, good equipment, but some of that is going to come right down to what can this machine do? What is the limit of what this machine can do? And there are things that, even with the newest perfect machine on the left, or, whatever manufacturer, that has a limit. And, Jack talked about the variation in it. There is variation. Now, you could move to an Epson or some type of inkjet, and you could get, almost no variation. But like on an Epson, you're talking 10 sheets an hour. You have a certain size. This is talking 19,000 sheets an hour in production with coating on all sorts of substrates with metallics and whites and things you can't do. So you have to live in that world a little bit. So machine capability becomes very important. Another thing for seeing what is actually really going to happen before you get to press is using test runs or drawdowns so that you can pre-check and make sure they can actually achieve a color. So if you have a color on a proofer or a color that's been printed or going to be printed in multiple locations, by using proof press drawdowns or test runs, you can kind of get a feeling beforehand what's going to happen. So if we take a look at this and how tolerances fit here, you can see machine capability is one part of it. One more factor that's going to complicate that for you is going to be finishing or specialty processes. So what do I mean by finishing? I mean lamination. So if it's going to be laminated, if it's going to be coated, if you're going on metallic ink, or if you're printing a white on metallic, or you have a special substrate, say a plastic or a poly or something. These special finishing things, especially if they can't read it when they run it, meaning if I don't get that measurement coming off the press and I have to stop and go somewhere else and do it, it becomes very, very difficult. And so you could have something that might be easy to do at 2.5 delta E, but because I have to jump off the press to laminate it, and to laminate it, I've already printed it, so I no longer can correct it, then you have to increase that tolerance quite a bit as well. So these offline special processes at the end mean they can't get your color on the press. They have to calculate it, which gives you another area where they're going to have a little more variation and a little less control. Now, the big question, and the reason this webinar kind of popped up, and this is some of what Jason can talk about, and Jack has some feedback on this as well because he runs into this. But what if you can't hit that tolerance? So there's a few things related to that. If you can't hit that tolerance, the first thing is that a lot of the brands that are out there, they may go out there, like I talked about a brand that has a 1 delta E requirement, but at the point that they have that, they're not measuring. So they're not actually aware that the suppliers aren't producing it at that level. So many brands, because unless they're measuring and checking, they don't actually realize that a printer may not be right on with that tolerance. The work is acceptable. Visually, they take it. Even though they have a low tolerance, they may not be aware of it. Second thing is if a tolerance can't be achieved, then a printer needs to communicate that back to the brand and work on what can we do? What's going to be our approach when we can't achieve this? So if there's a tolerance that we can't hit, or if we hit a tolerance and the color does still not appear right, then the printer and the brand need to be able to talk and come up with a strategy. So how are we going to work on this? What are we going to do about this? And I'll show an example of that in just a minute. And of course, the brand has to be realistic. There was an Idealliance podcast yesterday, which there's a whole bunch of them. I don't know if you guys have ever heard them, but Idealliance has podcasts, and they're pretty interesting because they're interviewing people about topics like this. Yesterday's one was with Dave Hunter, and he talked a lot about, of course you want 0 delta E, but what will you accept? And he's got a whole methodology about that. And that's, the big question is not, what delta E do you want? It's what will you accept? You can't get perfect, and that it's more expensive to get lower delta E's and higher quality. What will you accept? What will the brand take and accept? Related to this is the economy is very good. Most of the printing plants are loaded up and scheduled. They have more work than they can do in many cases. So if a brand becomes too difficult to work with, then the printer may fire them and consider firing them. And not just when the economy is good, but the main idea is that printers can't afford to lose money. The margins aren't that big in the printing industry. And if you're so demanding and so critical that they cannot get your jobs on and off press and can't make money on it, then a printer will consider leaving you and maybe moving you to their competitor where you can do some damage. So if you're too tight, then you become a real problem for a printer. And in many cases, they may want to get rid of you. And they may actually do it. So keep in mind the cost of perfection costs more. The higher the quality is, the more waste, the more make ready it takes, the more plate remakes we have to do, and the slower we print in order to maintain it. So perfection is expensive. I have a customer that I work with, and they said I could use this picture to illustrate something. And so if you look here, you can see there's delta E's in the middle, and you can see there's 1.38 delta E here, 1.64 delta E here, 1.42 here. So these are all within the close to or near the 1.5 delta E tolerance that they would like. But you can see in real life, you can see it. You can probably see it here a little bit. Look at the color difference between these two here. It's 1.42, 1.38 delta E. It's quite different looking. So this example is, what if you have tight tolerances and you have perfect delta E's, but the color is not good enough. So you can also see under there, in addition to using delta E, they started to use hue angle. So this is within 2 degrees. This is 0.8 degrees of the hue that they want, but still we have this visual difference. And that's where Jack was talking a little bit earlier about, not when I was talking on the phone with him before the webinar. What do you do when a customer, has such a tight tolerance? What do you do in a case like this? And, that's where the communication between the printer and the customer really becomes important. And, things such as 1.5 delta E, but you have to be off in, the red direction or whatever. So, because if the one on the left is off in one direction, the other one is off in another direction, 1.4 delta E, then we're almost 3 delta E between these two. So Jason will talk a little bit about that, and he's going to show some stuff that I found very interesting and helpful. But this, this is kind of real life case here. And this is where, certain colors like reds, blues, pastels, light blues, those colors, even with good delta E's, very often may present a match issue. So if it's one of those colors, which are the colors I just mentioned, what do you do? In the Flexo world, they use hue angles. Some of the brands, like you saw here, will also use a hue angle with those colors with the delta E. And then there's a visual part of it too, which is you may just have to work with the printer in those cases. That's an oddball case that you see there. Delta E usually is a pretty good indicator, but there are colors that it doesn't work very well on. So if we look at it, the big idea is the brand has to communicate what they want, and then the printer and the brand have to figure out, what are we going to agree is good? If I hit 1.4 delta E or 1.5 delta E, will you buy it? And if the color doesn't match, what do you want me to do in these cases? So the tolerances have to be set, but there has to be agreement, and it's pretty important for everybody to be willing to work with each other. the tolerances that you have to match the capability of the machine, and I showed those pictures of the old press and the new press. And then keep in mind that quality is expensive. Quality costs more. So that is a little bit of info on it, and I'm going to flip it over now to Jason Campbell. So Jason is a developer and color specialist at X-Rite, and he'll show a couple things related to these topics that are quite unique, related to delta E and hue, and in ways that BrandQ works with may look at stuff. So
yeah, thanks, Ron. I really want to start off emphasizing a couple of points that you made.
Sorry, we can't see you yet.
Yep. So under File and a Chair at the top.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things to bring up here.
So, here it's coming on.
Yep, here you go. All right, we're in business.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I got a couple little things to share with the attendees today. So let me get this stuff up because I do appreciate the invite and the chance to get to talk on the topic. Unfortunately, it came up a little bit late, but hey, we will certainly make the best of it and give a few examples here based on some conversation I had with Ron earlier this morning. But I do want to begin by emphasizing 2 or 3 key points that I took away from the last few minutes of your talk there, Ron. First off is communicating tolerances. I couldn't help but think to myself as you showed that one slide with the 3.0 and 2.0 and the 1.5 as examples of brand tolerances. And it's a Delta E2000. One thing that I'll speak about here in a minute is maybe some of the attendees here are familiar with the tolerance called Delta E CMC. And many times people say Delta E CMC 2-to-1. And maybe not necessarily understand what that 2-to-1 piece meant. But to keep it in really simple terms, it's basically that these color tolerance formulas have adjustment factors. So when I was looking at that slide, of course, being closer to the advisory piece of the business, I take it for granted that you probably meant 1-to-1-to-1, which is industry standard. And many brands, I think, implicitly specify these things. But, I'll get into it in a second here, but it's very important that when we have these tolerances, that even those additional details are part of that communication. A second piece to it, of course, is you shared some comments about machine capability, and Jack mentioned about machine and color capability as well. One that we get into, because the X-Rite business is very diverse in the things that we do. We have an industrial division. Just to give an example out there, to sort of really hammer home your point, Ron, when you work with our textile division and industrial division, some of those tolerances are 0.4 delta E. 0.4, they scrap the load. And so, it just depends on the process, the substrate, what's going on with the not just the machinery, but the process itself. What is it capable of? And really reiterate the word you used, which was, achievability. That is a big, big buzzword in anything we speak to customers about to manage that expectation. I think that we were talking earlier and said, I was in a corrugated shop earlier this week, and they were talking about a customer that wanted this very nice vivid yellow on brown craft corrugated. And that's not really hugely achievable without going through some serious hoops. But that all said, one of the big things that we got into was, okay, well, you had asked Jack and I, you had said, what do you do when we have a brand that is very particular about their brand identity. It's obviously very critical to them. It's their equity color. And I have a really low delta E, but I'm still not getting a visual match. Your slide was perfect earlier with those 3 different swatches. We deal with this all the time. And I said, one of the things that there's 2 pieces to it. One is if that's a formulated color, and even more so if it's, ECG or process, where you have something like a pastel. If that's a formulated color, it's important for those that are not, or that might not have had the experience of being in an ink room or sort of what those guys are challenged with to hit a formulated color. But in many cases, there's very, very little pigment. So imagine if you had to control the color of something where you only have 1 or 2% of the material is actually producing the color. And that's a really tall challenge. So things like near neutrals, pastels, they are wickedly difficult to not only obtain in an ink room, but then of course relay that to the machinery and produce the print work for the customer. So where there's got to be some trade-offs is in that delta E that we all are familiar with and all speak about is those little knobs that I spoke about, those weighting values. So while we have a couple of industry standard weighting values, and for delta E 2000, that's 1 to 1 to 1. You often see this as 1:1:1. That's sort of what you see in most software by all vendors. Those can be adjusted. And the really important part about adjusting those is it really controls the weighting factor and how important the different components of color comparison are to you when you're creating what that delta E number is. So that's to say that the first number is lightness, the second one chroma, and the third one is hue.
Jason, can you show this in your app?
Right. So ColorCert, to not make it a plug for ColorCert, simply put, is a tool that's often used for compliance to basically articulate these specifications and metrics that we want to measure. And one of the things that we have in here is the ability to dictate what those weighting factors are. So I have my delta E 2000 here, but I also have the ability to go ahead and manipulate those weighting values. So earlier today when I happened to be chatting with Ron, I said, we tend to have an acceptance factor around a variation in lightness, and actually generally a good one. We're pretty tolerant to that. And that's what's led to people using things like CMC 2 to 1. That means I'm going to tolerate twice the amount of lightness variation than the normal math of delta E CMC calculates. And that's the same thing that goes on with delta E 2000. So if I wanted to do something like that, I could say I want twice as much variation equals the same delta E. Okay? I can do the same with chroma. So between being a little stronger and more vivid, more chromatic, or less so, a little dirtier, a little bit more achromatic, I can adjust that. And the one that we get around the most is the one that human vision tends to be very fickle about, which is hue. And so a lot of times when we've run into this situation with brand customers and equity colors, where we do run into these challenges about the numbers don't tell the tale of the visual result, we might do something like 0.5, which means I'm going to turn the knob tighter to say I might accept a 2. But that means the variation that yields a 2 might come in the way of a little bit of lightness variation, or maybe the color's a little bit stronger or weaker, a little more chromatic. But I don't want my brand yellow to shift green. And I don't want it to shift orange. So I really want to constrain it. And that's a way, where you had talked, Ron, about getting into other metrics like looking at the hue angle as your customer's example was. This is a way to do it with an industry standard metric that's available pretty much in every solution out there. you had asked, you were sort of taken aback by, by the point of considering the adjustments to these weighting factors. And it really comes down to, as long as you can articulate that as part of the specification. And why I was picking on that one slide where you said, oh, a delta of 2, delta 2000, but is it a delta of 2 to 1 to 0.5, or is it 1 to 1 to 1? And those are the kind of things that are really critical, but give brand customers and equity color customers another tool in the toolbox to help, sort of wrangle what they're after. The other thing I was going to bring up is just an example from, say, a handheld. Many of the brand customers have, there's 2 or 3 major manufacturers, of which we're one, that they might have a handheld piece of equipment, a spectrophotometer, to do some color assessment when they go to a color OK. And such things are available in the handhelds in the same way. Again, it's just a matter of being able to articulate what that full compliance to what the specification is, not just what the acceptable value is, delta of 2. But as you see here, am I going to go and say, well, no, I would really like it to be, 0.5. And so those are the kind of things that one can do to help sort of communicate where there needs to be, a tighter tolerance put around the measurement, but not get into the complications of, layering metrics. Because that just, that makes it more and more difficult to communicate between the buyer and the supplier. And of course, you want a good relationship with your supplier and not make them crazy by coming in with a book of requirements. This keeps it very simple, but helps you constrain what you're looking for.
Yep. So layering, if you flip back to ColorCert, you were showing me how you could layer in, you could have your delta E plus your hue angle plus, you can just flip through that just to show people what layering is.
So, one of the things that, we do to address these kind of things with customers is the fact that we will have not only the adjustable weighting, but the fact that we can stack, multiple metrics together. So I might say, I can even differentiate and say in a job, a color might be high priority. So that might be that 1.5 you were talking about. We might have a 2, we might even have a 3. So that gives us ways to communicate medium, high, and low. Like maybe that's not a critical color, it's a highlight color, an accent color versus an equity color. And then likewise, we have the ability to say, well, you know what, I really don't want that swinging more than, say, 3 degrees in hue.
Yep.
Or maybe, plus or minus 5 chroma units. So, there's a way to sort of stack a secondary metric atop delta E to get further control of articulating, what you find works to say, is this a go, no go, and correlate that to the visual assessment.
So I think the last thing, if you could show it, and then we can go to questions, but if you can show that your elliptical mapping that you were showing me this morning.
Sure, yeah, I brought this up, and I did find the version, Ron, where I put the controls in there for changing the parametrics. So, this is a fairly crude little utility I built, a long time ago. But basically what it does is it really tries to, I kind of always tell people it's your Delta E Explorer. What happens when you change these numbers? What does it really look like when we plot these things? And so, one of the things that I can say is, so if this was my normal Delta E, now I'm making it big to try to make this a little better for the presentation. So I have a Delta of 5, for example. If I were to go in here and change this to a 0.5, 0.5 you're going to see what happened to that ellipse. That ellipse now just got a lot leaner. It just lost some weight.
Yep.
Notice it didn't get any longer or shorter.
Yep.
So I'm still accepting the same amount of chroma variation, and my L star, my lightness on the side there, that range didn't change. However, I am no longer accepting the variation in hue angle anymore by doing this. I've now cut it in half. And likewise, if I were to demonstrate that again by, say, doubling my chroma, well, now it's a lot longer because chroma is my axis from the center out to very strong color. So this tells me, well, now I'm allowed to control this. And anything that falls in that ellipse, keep in mind for our attendees, that's what dictates sort of the green check mark or the big red X with your suppliers. Because if I said this is a delta E of 5, of which this ellipse now is encompassing, if a measurement of your color by your supplier falls into there, that's saying I'm good to go.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's
some would say, well, why don't we
interesting.
just go, I think you had the example, Ron, of, say 2 delta E.
Yep.
So we'll put this back to 1 to 1 to 1. So this would give you an example of, say, what this might look like for this particular color. Well, notice if I were to just say, a 2 point or a 1.5, or even to 3, we'll just go down to a 1. See how everything just moved. The entire circle got smaller. All of my acceptance factor constrained. And that might be a bridge too far. When you're really trying to be strict about getting a good correlation, turning the delta E number down think of that as your course correction.
Yep.
And these adjustment weighting values are your fine tuning.
Jason, when I look at this, I see a great application potential in an ink room. Is it something that you see that maybe we would leave, really focus on the hue, maybe more coming out of the ink room, so that there's less of a problem when we get out to press?
Yeah, absolutely. What I was sharing with Ron earlier is some various projects and services, things that we do, often necessitate approaches more than just delta E for that very reason. As you're asking, one of our big focal points is holding hue accurate. So I might give up a little bit of chroma for the sake of holding hue. I think anybody that's engaged in a G7 where you're trying to dial in what are my densities to get my primary colors right, if you've ever been through that exercise with one of the Idealliance consultants, somebody like Ron, that has gone through that process, sometimes depending on the process in the ink, you may give up a little bit in favor of holding that hue angle, especially for spot color, brand color, because that's what we're most sensitive to when especially certain areas of color and those pastels, those really fine nuanced colors. If you shift, that's where an ink room might look at not just their delta E, that might be their house tolerance, but then they're also making use of things like what is their delta LABCH to say, okay, I'm off a bit, but look, I'm right on hue. I'm intolerant. I'm going to send that to the press room. That's the best I can do to give them the most wiggle room and keep the customer happy.
Yeah. So Jason, that was very good, very interesting. Didn't you think so, Jack?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's very powerful. So I think let's open it up to questions. So Steve, if you have questions, or Tim, and we'll go through some of these.
There's a number of questions that come in. I'll start with the first one that came in. I had to reword it a little bit to adapt it. So this company appears to have produced some proofs that have a variation with no paper simulation, and the expectation is to match the proof. And the question is really, what is the easiest way to explain the substrate difference when it might be slightly yellow? Because sales.
You mean? So it sounds like, and Jackie might be a good one for this, but if the customer is giving a proof with no substrate, but it's color, but it's being printed on a board or something with a color, what's the best way to educate them?
With no paper simulation, right? So
yeah.
sales doesn't understand it or doesn't want to upset the customer. This is like an everyday type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to work with the customer and do a little training, a little education that, color is dependent on the stock that it's printed on. There's just no way around it. And, I think that there are some great solutions out there that take the original digital target and adjust it for whatever substrate you're printing on to adjust the expectation. I think another way to address it with the customer is with accurate proofing. So if you have really accurate predictive proofing, then you can show them what the color is going to look like on the stock that they're printing it on.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. And sometimes I show I use the substrate calculator and generate profiles and pop them into Photoshop and just let them flip back and forth and compare it to the press sheets and the proofs.
And a lot of people today, in different types of technology and proofing, they might be even proofing now on the material they're printing on, which is a lot of movement in today's industry of simulation of that, and also using the type of material they're printing on. So we're seeing more and more of that simulation being able to be provided rather than different substrate. So the next question is, should we apply more effort in going into consulting with brands in regard to assessing delta E's that the brand can live with and the value of avoiding delta E's they do not need? So I'm interpreting that as meaning that here's what you have set forth, but perhaps what are you willing to live with, because here's the expectation. So maybe more of the approach being maybe bring value to them. That's how I'm reading.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit to that one.
Yeah.
It's very common when working with a brand, and it even applies to suppliers looking, they know that the game is changing and they're reflecting inwards, so really I'll say this very broadly, is what do you find acceptable? And having examples, maybe about a year ago, I was at a very large brand, and they had examples of what was upsetting them. So it was a really great way to communicate, this is what we want to stop, and here are examples of it. So we were able to take measurements. We were able to assess sort of some numbers and metrics around quantifying their visual happiness factor, if you will. And then working with them and consulting with them to blend that along with some of the industry specifications Ron spoke about earlier. So that's immensely valuable to take that time and spend time with a consultant to help sort of, manage that development of tolerances and metrics.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Jason, you had a number of questions that came in that were some that actually came in and you answered because your presentation was so good. So this and another one. So can weighting factors be applied globally as well as to specific drawdown or spot colors?
Yeah, so I see that came in from Bruce here. So I'm going to take a stab at my interpretation of that question. Assuming globally, meaning, all your delta E's that are being assessed for your work. I'm hoping I'm interpreting that correctly. If not, feel free, Bruce, to clarify. But in many software packages out there, QA, not just, the products from us, but, others in the business, usually have the ability to adjust those weighting factors, or may have multiple options for some of the more common variations. So in that case, as long as you're communicating that, it should be something that's, able to be implemented by your supplier. But again, it's very critical that not only do you communicate the acceptance factor, that delta E of 2, but those weighting factors as well. In terms of specific drawdown or spot, that really is a solution-specific, sort of capability. So if you mean, can I grade things one way, say my process colors with one delta E one way and a brand color another way with different weighting factors, that really is software specific. What I was showing allows that kind of flexibility, and that's sort of the philosophy of that particular tool. But the number one key is developing them, identifying them, and communicating them.
All right.
Yep, you're right.
Any comments about, here's a question, any comments about CP or CPK metrics?
So that's a first. I haven't really ever seen anybody raise, Six Sigma metrics up in any discussions.
That's from the U.S. actually.
I've never actually attacked it. I don't know if Ron or Jack, you've ever come across this.
Yeah.
But
no, not
in general,
not,
those tie into like upper and lower control limits in a process, and really, yeah. All I could say is one of our mutual colleagues out in the color sphere has a great little blog where he talks about the fact that delta E is not a great, it doesn't really apply to the same sort of defining upper and lower control limits, because how do you have a negative delta E? So he gets into that, but I've never really actually run into anybody applying that methodology to any of these metrics.
We actually just applied that methodology last week in Mexico, but for LEB you have to actually run 3 charts.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing I get involved in a lot of these conversations about, hey, we've got all this software these days and we collect a lot of data. This speaks to the attendee that asked the question about, conferring with a consultant on these type of things. And we get this big pile of data these days with the solutions that are out there from all the vendors and all the suppliers. And the big thing is, what do I do with it? So this is a really terrific question. So Jack, I definitely would love to have another talk with you about that, because I think that speaks to, ways to tackle the same problem.
Yep. Yeah, no, good question.
So, and we'll have, let's see, we'll go two more questions very quickly. So how acceptable is MBR being used in the industry for metallic tolerancing? Are there, I'll just leave that for the sake of time. So how acceptable is MBR being used in the industry for metallic tolerancing?
Good question.
I mean, I'll field it. I didn't know if you were grab that one. So MBR is metallic brilliance ratio. It's essentially a take on SRR gloss, and it's the difference between a specular included and excluded measurement. So you really need, it really speaks to a spherical measurement device, which for anyone that's not aware, there's really kind of 2 different mainstream methodologies that these spectros, these color measurement instruments that you hear about or own, operate. And that, I don't know, Ron, if that's crossed any of the standards bodies or been maybe presented to the standards bodies.
Well, not really. No, there's no connection. So when you hit the world of metallics, you're, you know,
Yeah,
I mean,
it's the Wild
it's
West.
used in the, it's used in the ink room, and they can do some stuff. But yeah, no, it's the Wild West, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, for us, the way that we approached it, it's a metric that it's finding its way around a little bit. It was promoted by extremely large consumer brand, and they promoted it. So outside of that, I don't know if there's been traction to try to get it more and more ratified as a sanctioned metric around assessing metallics.
Yeah, I don't see it very much. Yeah.
And the last question
metallics
is
definitely are a difficult one.
Yeah.
I'll give the last question to Jack. Jack, in the image that you drew of yourself, in regards to tolerance levels, that when you share that image with other people that know you and work with you daily, such as founding members and people that you come in contact with at work, in regards to tolerances, what was the factor of, let's say, 1 to 5 of likeness to actual result?
Well, it was very good, but I just shaved, so now it's a little off.
Okay, so you might be around a 3.
Yeah.
And you find it to be
variation.
acceptable. Yeah.
Variation in the machine.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I would like to really thank the panelists and absolutely always Ron Ellis for contributing to today's webinar, and everyone that has joined us from around the world for this. Really appreciate your time, especially on today, Good Friday. I hope everybody has an incredible, wonderful, reflective weekend. And thank you for always joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again in the next BrandQ webinar.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, and you guys. Yeah, and you'll get a recording and links and all that stuff, everyone. Thanks. Have a good weekend.
Take care.